Spain is the king of football. 4 World Cups combined across the men's and women's game, a decade of dominance built on quick feet, quicker passing, and a style so distinctive it earned its own name, tiki-taka. Commentators credit the coaching academies. Pundits credit the youth systems. But almost nobody talks about the fruit sitting on every table in every Spanish household, the one that shows up in breakfast, lunch, and dinner, from gazpacho to pan con tomate, to the sauce underneath half the country's tapas. Here's the strange part. That fruit isn't even from Spain. It isn't even from Europe. For nearly 200 years after it arrived on Spanish shores, people were terrified of it. They thought it was poison. So today we're tracing the full journey of a single plant, from the highlands of the Andes, through the fear and superstition of a suspicious continent, into the kitchens of peasants who quietly turned it into the backbone of a national diet, and finally onto the pitch, where a nation fueled by tomatoes built one of the greatest footballing dynasties the sport has ever seen. By the end of this video, you'll understand why, without this one ingredient, Spain's trophy cabinet might look very different. Think about that for a second. A country's entire footballing identity, tied not to a coach, not to a stadium, not to a single golden generation of players, but to a fruit that arrived as a stowaway on a ship, was declared dangerous by the very people who could have afforded to eat it safely, and was only saved by the people who had no choice but to eat what grew in their own fields. That's the kind of history that never makes it into a matchday program, and it's exactly the kind of history worth digging into. Let's start at the beginning, because the tomato's story does not start in Spain. It starts thousands of miles away, in the western coast of South America, where wild tomato plants grew as small, tart, berry-sized fruits, nothing like the smooth red globes we know today. Indigenous peoples in the region we now call Peru and Ecuador were likely the first to notice these little fruits, though it was further north, in Mesoamerica, that the plant was properly domesticated. The Aztecs called it tomatal, which is where our modern word comes from. And by the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, tomatoes were already a staple of Aztec cooking, chopped into sauces with chili peppers, ground on stone tools, and served alongside the other pillars of the Mesoamerican diet, like maize and beans. When Hernán Cortés and his men encountered the markets of Tenochtitlan, they were walking through what was, by some accounts, one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on earth at the time, and tomatoes were part of the produce stalls there. It didn't take long for Spanish ships to start carrying seeds and cuttings back across the Atlantic, part of the enormous transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New that historians now call the Columbian Exchange. Potatoes, corn, chili peppers, and cacao went one direction. Wheat, horses, and, less happily, smallpox went the other. The tomato was just one small passenger in this much larger biological trade, but it would end up having an outsized effect on the country that received it first. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how strange this whole exchange really was. Before 1492, the cuisines of Europe, Asia, and Africa had never encountered tomatoes, potatoes, corn, chili peppers, chocolate, or vanilla. Italian food had no tomatoes. Indian and Thai cooking had no chili heat. Irish diets had no potatoes. All of that was still locked away on a continent nobody in Europe knew existed. The tomato's arrival in Spain wasn't just one ingredient joining a pantry. It was the opening chapter of a culinary revolution that would eventually reshape what traditional food looked like on 3 separate continents. And Spain, simply by being the first port of call for ships returning from the Americas, ended up as the tomato's very first European home. So the tomato lands in Spain sometime in the early to mid-1500s, and you might expect a fruit this vibrant, this useful, this eventually beloved, to be welcomed with open arms. It wasn't. For the better part of 2 centuries, most of Europe treated the tomato with deep suspicion. And there's actually a fascinating, slightly gruesome scientific explanation for part of that fear. Wealthy Europeans of the era ate off pewter plates, and pewter has a high lead content. Tomatoes are acidic. When an acidic fruit sits on a lead-heavy plate, it can leach lead out of the metal and into the food. Aristocrats who ate tomatoes off their fancy pewter dinnerware sometimes got sick, and some historians believe cases of lead poisoning were mistakenly blamed on the fruit itself rather than the plate it was served on. Poorer households, meanwhile, ate off simple wooden or earthenware dishes, no lead involved, and had no such problems. It's a strange twist. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were to believe the tomato was dangerous, because your own dinnerware was quietly poisoning you. That wasn't the only reason for suspicion either. Botanists of the time noticed the tomato plant belonged to the nightshade family, the same family as belladonna, a genuinely toxic plant used for centuries as a poison. The resemblance in the leaves and flowers was enough to make herbalists nervous, and some early writers labeled the tomato as an ornamental curiosity at best, something to grow in a garden and admire, not something to put in your mouth. In parts of northern Europe, the tomato was nicknamed the poison apple, and for a long stretch, that reputation stuck. There's a certain irony worth sitting with here. The nightshade family that made herbalists so nervous also includes potatoes, eggplants, and peppers, all of which eventually became dietary staples across the very same continent that once eyed them with suspicion. The tomato wasn't uniquely dangerous. It was simply unfamiliar, and unfamiliar foods tend to get treated as guilty until proven innocent. It took generations of quiet, unglamorous eating, mostly among people history rarely bothers to name, before that reputation finally wore off. But here's the twist historians love to point out. While the nobility were writing warnings about the poison apple and keeping it as a decorative plant, the working people of southern Spain, particularly in regions like Andalusia, were quietly doing something very different. They were eating it. Peasants and laborers didn't have access to imported spices or the luxury foods of the aristocracy. What they had was sun, olive oil, stale bread, and whatever grew well in the hot, dry soil of the Iberian Peninsula. And it turned out the tomato grew extremely well there. It thrived in the Mediterranean climate, almost as if it had been designed for it, producing fruit in abundance with relatively little water and care. So while the upper classes fretted over poison, farmers and cooks in the South were folding tomatoes into simple, practical dishes, because the fruit was cheap, plentiful, and, as it turns out, delicious. This is where one of Spain's most iconic dishes starts to take shape: gazpacho. The earliest versions of gazpacho actually predate the tomato entirely. They were built around bread, olive oil, water, garlic, and vinegar, a cold soup designed to keep laborers hydrated and fed during brutal summer heat in the fields. It was cheap, it traveled well, and it cooled you down in a climate where working outdoors in August could be genuinely dangerous. Once the tomato entered the picture, probably sometime in the 1700s, it transformed the dish. Tomatoes brought natural sweetness, acidity, and a deep red color. And just as importantly, they brought hydration and vitamin C at a moment when fresh produce wasn't always easy to come by for rural workers. Tomatoes are roughly 94% water, which made gazpacho an even more effective way to keep field laborers from overheating, while the vitamin C helped guard against deficiencies that were common in diets heavy on bread and grain. What had been a peasant's hydration trick became, with the tomato's arrival, something close to a functional sports drink centuries before that term existed. Picture a farmhand in Andalusia in the middle of July. The sun is directly overhead, the fields shimmer with heat, and there is no shade for miles. A bowl of cold gazpacho, thick with tomato, garlic, and good olive oil, wasn't a delicacy in that context. It was survival food, engineered by trial and error to solve a very specific physical problem. How do you keep a human body cool, hydrated, and nourished through a day of hard labor with almost no refrigeration and almost no money? Nobody involved was thinking about antioxidants in the modern scientific sense. They were simply noticing which foods made people feel better and work longer, and the tomato kept winning that quiet, unrecorded contest. And that connection between the tomato and physical stamina is worth pausing on, because it's the thread that eventually leads us to football. Tomatoes are rich in something called lycopene, the pigment responsible for that deep red color. Lycopene is a powerful antioxidant, and one of the more surprising findings in food science is that cooking or processing tomatoes actually increases the amount of lycopene your body can absorb, rather than destroying it the way heat destroys some other nutrients. Raw tomatoes are good for you, but a rich tomato sauce, simmered slowly, releases more usable lycopene than the raw fruit does, because the heat breaks down the plant's cell walls and makes the compound easier for your body to access. This is part of why Mediterranean cooking traditions that rely heavily on slow-cooked tomato sauces, from Spanish sofrito to Italian ragu, may deliver more of this antioxidant benefit than a fresh tomato salad ever could. Antioxidants like lycopene help the body manage oxidative stress, which is essentially cellular wear and tear caused by intense physical exertion. Athletes generate a lot of oxidative stress every time they train or compete, and diets rich in antioxidants have long been associated with better recovery times and reduced inflammation. This doesn't mean a plate of pasta with tomato sauce turns anyone into a professional athlete, but it does mean that a population whose everyday cuisine is built around tomato-based dishes, olive oil, and fresh vegetables, the exact combination we now call the Mediterranean diet, has a nutritional foundation that happens to align very well with what modern sports scientists recommend for recovery and endurance. It helps to understand what's actually happening at a cellular level here, in plain terms. When muscles work hard, they burn oxygen at a much faster rate than usual, and that process generates unstable molecules called free radicals as a natural byproduct. Left unchecked, free radicals can damage cell membranes and slow down the repair process muscles rely on after intense effort. Antioxidants, like lycopene, neutralize those free radicals before they can do much damage, essentially mopping up the cellular mess left behind by a hard training session. This is why nutritionists who work with endurance athletes so often point to tomato-rich diets as a low-cost, food-first way to support recovery. It's the same chemistry, just delivered through gazpacho instead of a pill. By the 1700s and 1800s, tomatoes had moved from suspicious garden ornament to essential Spanish crop. Spanish sailors and colonists carried the plant, along with the growing culinary tradition around it, to the Spanish colonies across the Americas and the Pacific, creating a kind of round trip. A plant that started in the Americas, was adopted in Spain, and was then reintroduced to other parts of the world under Spanish influence, this time as a cultivated crop rather than a wild curiosity. Meanwhile, back on the Iberian Peninsula, tomato-based dishes kept multiplying. Pan con tomate, simple bread rubbed with ripe tomato, olive oil, and salt, became a breakfast staple, particularly in Catalonia. Sofrito, a base of slow-cooked tomatoes, onions, and garlic, became the foundation for countless stews and rice dishes, including paella. By the 20th century, the tomato wasn't just accepted in Spain, it was inseparable from Spanish identity, culturally and nutritionally. By this point, the tomato had quietly worked its way into nearly every meal of the day. Breakfast might mean pan con tomate. Lunch, the largest meal in traditional Spanish life, might feature a rice dish built on sofrito, or a stew simmered for hours with a tomato base, doing the heavy lifting of flavor. Dinner, lighter and later than in most of Europe, might circle back to a cold gazpacho or its thicker cousin, salmorejo, especially in the punishing heat of an Andalusian summer. A visitor to Spain in the 1800s could easily have gone an entire week eating 3 tomato-based meals a day without ever noticing a pattern, simply because the fruit had become invisible in its ubiquity, the way salt or bread is invisible in most cuisines. That invisibility is really the endpoint of the tomato's long journey from feared poison to unremarkable staple, and it's exactly the kind of transformation that tends to get lost from the history books, because nobody writes a dramatic account of a food quietly becoming ordinary. Which brings us to the part of the story where a health habit becomes a sporting legacy. Modern sports science has become increasingly interested in the relationship between traditional regional diets and athletic performance, and the Mediterranean diet, with tomatoes as one of its central pillars, is frequently cited in nutrition research as a model for reducing inflammation, supporting cardiovascular health, and improving recovery between bouts of intense exercise. Spanish football's youth academies, the same academies that produce generations of technically gifted players known for relentless movement and quick, sustained pressing, particularly during the tiki-taka era, operate within a broader food culture where tomato-rich meals are simply the default, not a specialized performance diet imposed from outside, but the ordinary, everyday way people already eat. Players training from childhood inside that food culture are absorbing, meal after meal, year after year, The same antioxidant-rich, vegetable-forward diet that sports scientists spend careers trying to design from scratch for elite athletes elsewhere. Consider what that actually means in practice. A young player working through a Spanish Academies youth system isn't handed a specially formulated nutrition plan drawn up by a sports scientist. They're simply eating what their family eats, what the academy canteen serves, what's normal in the surrounding culture, and that ordinary diet happens to be extraordinarily well-suited to the demands of high-intensity, high-repetition football. A talented young player developing in a food culture built around heavier, less vegetable-forward staples might need a nutritionist to deliberately introduce many of the same benefits later in their career, almost as a corrective measure. Spain's advantage, if you can call it that, isn't a secret program. It's a 500-year head start, baked into the everyday dinner table long before anyone thought to measure it. There's a kind of poetic symmetry to this, if you zoom out far enough. The tomato plant itself is famously tenacious. It can grow in poor soil, tolerate drought better than many comparable crops, and produce fruit in punishing heat that would wilt more delicate plants. It survives conditions that should, by all rights, defeat it. And there's an obvious parallel to the way Spanish football is often described, a style built on relentlessness, on players who keep pressing, and keep passing, and keep moving, even when the match seems to demand exhaustion. A footballing culture that, like the plant at its dinner table, simply refuses to wilt under pressure. Every summer, the town of Buñol in Valencia hosts La Tomatina, a festival where tens of thousands of participants throw ripe tomatoes at each other in the streets, until the entire town turns a deep, unmistakable red. It started, almost by accident, as a spontaneous food fight among young people in the 1940s, and it has since grown into one of Spain's most famous cultural exports. An entire town drenched in tomato pulp, a literal sea of red stretching from one end of the plaza to the other. It's not hard to see the visual echo, decades later, whenever a Spanish national team victory sends a stadium full of fans into a sea of red shirts and scarves, waving flags the exact color of the fruit that quietly built the diet behind the team wearing them. None of this means tomatoes alone win World Cups. Coaching, infrastructure, youth development systems, tactical philosophy, and no small amount of talent and luck all play their part, and no nutrition documentary should pretend otherwise. But food history rarely gets to claim center stage next to trophies and tactics, even though it's sitting quietly behind almost every great sporting culture in the world. The tomato story in Spain is a 500-year journey from a small, tart Andean berry to a feared poison apple locked out of aristocratic kitchens, to a peasant's practical, hydrating staple in the fields of Andalusia, to the lycopene-rich, antioxidant-packed backbone of one of the world's most celebrated diets, to, finally, one quiet ingredient sitting on the tables of the players and families who built a footballing dynasty. It's easy to look at a bowl of gazpacho or a plate of pan con tomate and see nothing more than a simple, comforting meal. But behind that simple meal is a plant that crossed an ocean, survived centuries of suspicion, fed generations of laborers who couldn't afford anything fancier, and ended up, almost by accident, nourishing the very athletes who would go on to define an era of the world's most popular sport. Spain's victories were centuries in the making, and they started with a single seed from the New World, one that almost nobody in Europe was brave enough to eat. If you enjoyed tracing the journey of a dangerous plant that quietly reshaped a nation, we've got another one for you. Check out our deep dive on the history of cinnamon, another so-called poison that ended up building an empire of its own.